Okay, welcome everybody. This is the first of 5 sessions of the mini-series called Food for Thought, the Torah of Eating here at Web Yeshiva with me, Uri Cohen. And the plan is that, I hope this will work. The plan is that we're going to cover 3 topics in each session. Maybe in one of them we'll cover only 2, but the plan is to cover 3 topics, 2 hashkafa topics, uh, 2 topics that relate to Jewish thought, and 1 topic that relates to halacha or minhag, Jewish law or custom. And then at the end, whether we'll have time or to go over it or not, I have uh, collected a few uh, recipes or suggestions of desserts that relate to the parsha. Just in case we don't get to it, the material is available on the course page at Web Yeshiva. But we have a lot to cover. Let me just do a very brief introduction. There's so much to say about food. What I The topics that I've chosen, at least the hashkafa topics that I've chosen, um, are mostly from based on the first chapter of this book, Festival of Freedom, Essays on Pesach and the Haggadah by Rabbi Yosef Dov Halevi Soloveitchik, the Rav. He has an essay which would seem to be about the Seder. It's called An Exalted, no, 1 second. Yeah, it's called An Exalted Evening, the Seder Night. But and he does talk about the Seder, but most of the essay is to try to answer the following question, which is, I'm paraphrasing it, which is, what makes our eating different from the eating on the part of animals? People have bodies. We eat because our bodies need nourishment, but animals also eat because they need nourishment. What exactly separates us, whether as human beings or as Jews or both? What exactly separates us and elevates or can elevate our eating that allows it to be better, more meaningful than that of the animals? That's the question that Rabbi Soloveitchik poses, and he gives 4 answers. And we're going to, over the next 5 weeks, we're going to relate to all 4 of those answers. In 2 or 3 of them, we'll look at some words of Rav Soloveitchik. But that's not the point. The point is his general answers are, I'll quickly summarize them now before we get to the first source sheet. First answer of what can make human and or Jewish eating special is that animals are not selective. They eat whatever they need to eat. Their bodies know what they can handle, and that's it. But people can be selective. People don't eat just anything that is technically edible. And then within being selective, we'll talk momentarily about the idea of eating uh, in order to well, I don't want to give it away. But we'll talk about how kashrut is one type of being selective. We'll get to that shortly. That's Rav Soloveitchik's first answer. His second answer is that for an animal, eating is completely mechanical. There's no understanding of what's going on. But people can have awe when they eat. They can be in awe of the food, the people who prepared the food. There can be eating for a higher purpose. We'll talk about that. Also, in this session, we'll talk about elevating our eating by having in mind that we're serving God. And in a couple weeks, we'll talk about having gratitude. All that is in Rav Soloveitchik's essay. His third answer of what separates or can separate people from animals in eating is that an animal eats by itself, or at least some animals eat by themselves, not necessarily aware of any others, whereas people have the option of combining eating with companionship, with being with other people. And Rav Soloveitchik, that's the longest part of this essay. He talks about the chesed community, the teaching community. We'll talk about both of those in session 4. And finally, Rav Soloveitchik's fourth answer is that for an animal, eating is limited to the physiological act of gratification. It doesn't relate to anything else. Eating is eating. That's it. It's necessary. That's fine. But people have the option of making, of putting this activity of eating into a different frame of reference, into making it meaningful in some way. And Rav Soloveitchik ties that into to our covenant with God, and we're going to end up doing that in the fifth session. So that's not everything we're going to say in this mini course, but several of the approaches that I've selected are based on these four answers of Rav Soloveitchik. Having said that, let's talk about the first topic, first of three. One of them is how we can gain by keeping kosher. Now, there's a lot to say about keeping kosher. Ultimately, we don't know what the meaning of kashrut, because it's considered a chok, the type of mitzvah that either there's no explanation for, or at least that we don't fully understand. Having said that, having said that, we explain chukim. We try to understand even the things that aren't necessarily so understandable, and there are a bunch of answers that are given in rabbinic literature to what's the meaning of kashrut. Maybe not why God commanded it. That would be nice, but at the very least, what we can get out of it. I mentioned this in other contexts. I think it was in the myth busting. There's two ways to answer the question of why. There's why, as in what causes it, and then there's why, what's it for? And at least maybe it's only on the level of drash and not pshat, I don't know, but at least some suggest that that's why in Rabbinic Hebrew there are two words for why, madua and lama. These days, I don't think anybody uses madua anymore, but madua and lama technically both mean why, but if you're going to make a distinction between them, you could say madua is why, as in what causes it, and lama is for what. Lama is lema, for what? What's it for? What do I get out of it? That doesn't necessarily mean that explains why it's here in the first place. Why kashrut is here in the first place, you can give all sorts of guesses, but at the very least, we can recognize that there are certain positive results that can be associated with kashrut, depending on how you look at it. But I just want to present two approaches here, and this is going to fit in with Rav Soloveitchik's first answer, namely, what can elevate human eating from animal eating? Because humans can be selective. Humans can use their intellect to determine what they want to eat, what they think is appropriate to eat. And even people who don't keep kashrut, pretty much everybody has some sort of diet, has some sort of way in which they limit themselves. And the people who don't limit themselves end up writing books about how they ate this and they ate that, and they traveled all over the world, and they ate animals that nobody would have ever imagined that you could eat. But for the rest of us, everybody else has a diet. The question is, what are the rules of your diet? Who's making the rules? What do you get out of it? Anyway, so two approaches, each, and by the way, just to contrast with other shiurim that I might have given, whether here at WebYeshiva or elsewhere, every topic that we're doing for this course is a one-page source sheet, which is a little difficult for me to do, and that's why we're doing three of them in each session, but one page. Two answers. The value of obeying God. This appears in Chazal. It appears in one of the midrashim that explains kashrut as follows. Let's look at it together. Source number one. On the pasuk in Shmuel Bet, Ha'el Tamim Darko. God's ways are perfect. Imrat Hashem Tzrufa. God's speech, where God says is not purified. Trying to think, there's a better word for it. Forged. It's forged, as in forging metal. Magenu l'chol chosim bo. God is a shield to everyone who trusts in Him. All of God's ways are perfect. What does God care? That is literally what the Midrash just said. What does God care? Whether you kill an animal by slaughtering it from the front through the requirement of shechita in order to make the animal kosher, and then you eat it. What does God care whether you kill the animal that way or whether you stab it or maybe you chop its head off in some other way? Klum moilo umaziko. Does it, the way you kill the animal, does it help God or hurt God? No. Omayach patlo, and furthermore, what does God care? Bein ochel tameot ochel tarot. Whether you eat a kosher, whether you eat a non-kosher type of species like a pig or a kosher type of species like a cow. What does God care? And it's at least for me anyway. It's kind of jarring to see that kind of expression because it sounds like a very modern type of complaint. What does God care about any of this? Actually, Chazal asked the same question. What does God care? After all, whether I eat this or that, whether I kill an animal this way or that way, it doesn't affect God. God's above that. God is quote unquote perfect, meaning separate, like the transcendent. What I do does not affect God. Ella, rather, im chachamta lach. Pasuk in Mishlei. If you are wise for yourself, meaning if you make what the Torah considers to be the right decision, you're doing it for your own benefit. And that's okay. The mitzvot were given to people only litzaref bahem. There's that word, to forge them. Just like you can forge metal into a better, pure type of metal. The purpose of our having mitzvot at all is to forge us into better people, as it says, Imrat Hashem Tzrufa. Lama, why? Shuma Genelecha, because it well, no, I'm sorry. God is shielding you. God is protecting you. Meaning, what's the connection in the pasuk that we started with between forging and protecting? God wants to protect us, meaning God wants us to become better versions of ourselves. Therefore, God gives us mitzvot, which can make us into better people. The question then is, okay, how? How does my choice of how to kill an animal or which animal or any other food choice or any other mitzvah choice, whether to do a mitzvah or not, how does that make me a better person? That is not explained, meaning it could be that that's the aspect that's still a chok. We still don't, even according to this midrash, there's no explanation. Oh, and the reason that making this choice leads you to become this kind of person, that you could argue that that's still on the level of chok. Nevertheless, this is a fascinating concept because, according to this, not only is not only is kashrut something that we do because God said so, it is, but it's for our benefit. That's not obvious at all. If you were talking about a mishpat, a mitzvah where the reason for it is obvious: don't murder, don't steal, don't commit adultery. Lots of societies have those, and they're part of the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach. So it should be obvious. God wants us to live in a stable society, aside from everything else. But to say that a mishpat is for our sake, that makes a lot of sense. That's why God gave us these mishpatim, so that we can be better people, so that we can have a better society. But that even a chok like kashrut, that can be for our sake, that's an unusual idea. The way that Rabbi Harold Kushner puts it, he's a very prominent senior rabbi in the conservative movement. The way he puts it in his book To Life isn't it incredible? Nearly 8 billion people on this planet, and God cares what I have for lunch. And then he goes on to say, and God cares how I earn and spend my money, and whom I sleep with, and what sort of language I use. What better way is there to invest every one of my daily choices with divine significance? Meaning, even if I can't explain the meaning behind a particular mitzvah, a particular rule of kashrut, nevertheless, if you start with the assumption that God is behind it and it's to make us better people. Wow. So then God cares. The idea that God cares about me. Rabbi Kushner is more or less taking the same idea as this midrash. He goes on to say, what the Jewish way of life does by imposing rules on our eating and sleeping and working habits is to take the most common and mundane activities and invest them with deeper meaning, turning every one of them into an occasion for obeying or disobeying God. We're going to come back to this idea on the next page when we talk about doing everything with Shem Shamayim, doing everything. Hopefully, everything we do can be done to serve God, but that minimally, the mitzvot that God has given us are opportunities for obeying or disobeying God. So minimally, the value of obeying God is that even if we don't understand how, there is this concept that God has our best interest in mind. I see that Noah asked, could it be that mitzvot that are chukim make us better people simply by forcing us to practice constraint? Yeah, not only could it be that, but that's answer number 2. Woohoo! Approach number 2. Thank you, Noah, for that excellent segue. The value of self-control. This I did not find in a classic source. I found it in Shadal, Rav Shmuel David Lutzato, an unusual combination of rabbi scholar in the 1800s. Only some of his commentary has been translated into English. This is from one of his commentaries, one of his books, which has not been translated into English. And he says that in general, mitzvot, not just mitzvot, but chukim, they help us l'tikun hamidot, to improve our character traits in 2 ways, he says. The first way is going to be what we just said, and the second way is going to be self-control. Ha'echad, the first one is ki ha'mitzvot ha'elohiot, mitzvot from God, sh'adam shomer, that a person follows. Harehen mazkirot oto b'chol sha'a et hakel. They remind you of God at all times. I mean, that's if you're mindful about it. If you're not mindful, then no, it doesn't remind you of God, but it can. It can. If you just think about why you're doing. In general, this ties into the issue of mindfulness and paying attention to what you're doing. There's so much you could say about that. I'm going to skip it for now, but this ties into that a lot. That just thinking that God asked me to do that. In general, when kashrut is taught, people don't mention God because God said the rules all the way back, very briefly in the Torah, but almost everything we have of kashrut is Torah Shabbat Peh, and there are a zillion details. So God kind of gets lost in the details. It's understandable, but really that's not ideal. The ideal is that when we exercise our kashrut choices, in the store, I'm going to buy this, I'm not going to buy that. In the back of my mind, I should think that this is what God wants, or at the very least, God cares about what I have for lunch, even if many of these details are rabbinic, and God didn't give these details directly, but it doesn't matter. God asked us to follow the rabbinic authorities and gave them the right to make these details. So it ends up that directly or indirectly, I'm thinking about God when I make these choices. So that more or less is a variation on what we said before, the first approach. V'hatzad hasheni, the second aspect of how following mitzvot, including chukim, like kashrut, how it makes you a better person is because he says it helps you limshol berucho. It helps you control yourself, as it says in Eicha, tov lagever ki yisa ol bin urav. It's good for a person to carry the yoke when he's young, meaning as part of growing up, you should learn self-discipline. And that's the way he's understanding it. And then he quotes a Greek philosopher. I mentioned before, Shadal was a scholar as well as Talmud Chacham. The philosopher Epictetus. I'll just write it out in English in the chat. He said, and this is presumably paraphrased because I doubt that Epictetus was writing in Hebrew. Im yasim hadam al libo. If you just pay attention to shtei milot ela, the following 2 words, batuachu shelo yachata, then you won't sin. V'yu kol yamav b'shalom, you will live a life of peace. Ve'elohein, and here they are, svol ufrosh. In the Latin, I guess it was Latin. So steen et absteen. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing the Latin correctly. which is literally suffer, but meaning hold yourself back, and abstain. Klomar, Shadal comments, Sivol hatzar ufrosh min hatanug. You should uh, you should take on yourself the pain of not getting what you want, and separate yourself from indulgences. He says, Ribuy ha-mitzvot, most of most of the mitzvot, or having so many mitzvot, margil ha'adam, it gets a person in the hergel, it gets a person in the habit of limshol berucho, to control himself. Just one quick example of this, and then we'll move on to the next topic. Rabbi Jack Reamer, another conservative rabbi, mentioned this. I couldn't find the original, but I found a sermon in which, quoting Rabbi Reamer, he was in the supermarket and he was very impressed by something that happened to him. The people in front of me were a man and his child. My guess is the child was probably about 5 or 6 years old. They were probably Jewish. They were both wearing kippot and they were speaking Hebrew to each other, right? That's how he guesses that they were Jewish. So the child said what all little children say when they're in a supermarket: "Can I have these cookies?" The father took the cookies, read the ingredients carefully, and said, "No, they're not kosher." That's not the climax of the story. The climax of the story is what happened next. You know what happened next? Nothing. The kid said, "Okay," and that was the end of it. So Rabbi Reamer comments, "I was deeply moved by this brief encounter. Here was a child who at the age of 5 or 6 had already learned the meaning of a word of which many grown-ups have not learned the meaning. He had learned, thanks to the fact that his family keeps kosher, the meaning of the word no." The meaning of the word no, that is something that more people need to think about. If we can instill it in ourselves as when we're young, and the assumption is if we can extend it, not just limit it to kashrut. Yes. Oh, yes, I learned kashrut when I was a little kid, so I know all the rules of kashrut. No, you're supposed to extrapolate from that. The value of controlling yourself and being selective of what you eat, as Rabbi Soloveitchik said, that's what separates us from animals. That is intrinsically a good thing. Self-control is intrinsically a good thing, even when you don't have in mind that it's from God. But if you have in mind that it's from God, then you can have both of these together. The value of obeying God and the value of self-control. So just to wrap up this topic, one of Rabbi Soloveitchik's answers to the question of what can separate human eating from animals eating is we can be selective of what we eat. In the case of Jews, following halacha, we are selective by keeping kashrut. And now we're moving on to the other hashkafa topic, which is going to relate to a different answer Rav Soloveitchik gives to the same question, and that is eating LeSheim Shamayim, for the sake of heaven. This is how we transform a physical activity into a spiritual activity. And the source of this idea goes all the way back to Pirkei Avot, here in source number 1. V'chol ma'asecha yehiyu l'shem shamayim. Everything you do should be for the sake of heaven. So the question is, what does that translate into? I found 2 approaches. There are probably many approaches, but 2 that appear in classic sources, in my major sources, the Shulchan Aruch and the Mishnah Torah of the Rambam. Rav Karo, in the Shulchan Aruch, in Orach Chaim Siman Reish Lamed Aleph, he has a separate siman, separate section, which in the Mishnah Berurah is an entire page, separate section of halacha called "Everything you do should be for the sake of heaven," and it's based on Rabbeinu Yonah. We're not going to read the Rabbeinu Yonah inside. In fact, we're not even going to read the entire Shulchan Aruch, but just a little bit. Rav Karo quotes Pirkei Avot here, and he interprets it as follows: Afilu dvarim shereshut. Not only should you follow halacha, and you should make sure to do what you have to do, make sure to avoid doing what you're not allowed to do. That's the letter of the law. But above and beyond the letter of the law, even things that are optional, reshut, kigon, for example, ha'achila v'ashtiyah, eating and drinking, right? It doesn't, because beyond kashrut, the Torah doesn't tell us how to eat and drink, how much, whether to eat in the minimum that we need to be healthy, or to eat healthier food. The Torah doesn't address that directly. The Ramban elsewhere, when he talks about Kadoshim Tiyu, how to be holy, the example that he gives of how somebody can follow the entire Torah and still be a disgusting person, what's his example? Gluttony. You could follow all the laws of kashrut and still turn into a disgusting person if you act like a glutton. So that fits very well with this, that technically the glutton is not violating anything, but it doesn't matter. That's an example of how you eat or how much you eat. That's up to you. You should take that, turn that into the way to serve God, which we're about to see now. Rav Karo says, eating and drinking, v'ha'alicha, you're walking, v'ha'yeshiva, sitting, v'ha'kima, getting up, v'ha'tashmish, sex, v'ha'sicha, speaking, v'chol tzarchei gufcha, and all the needs of your body. You kulam, all of them, la'avodat borecha. They should be directed, all of them should be directed to the service of God. Or l'davar hagorem avodato. Or they should be directed to something that itself can lead to serving God. We'll see an example of this in the Rambam. He doesn't give that many examples here, but the way that he sums it up, and this is not the whole thing. It's there's more. I recommend going through it in the Shulchan Aruch, which you can find in the Mishnah Berurah's commentary on the Shulchan Aruch as well. Klalo shel davar. The general rule is, Rav Karo sums up, chayav adam, a person should, not chayav, obligated halachically, but morally obligated. Lasum einav v'libo adrachav. You should set your eyes and your heart on your ways. In other words, you should be mindful. You should be aware of what you're doing. V'lishkol kol masav b'moznei sichlo. And you should weigh all of your actions on the scales of your intellect. You should decide whether to do something or not just based on what it says in the Torah, that too, but also based on what makes sense, what is appropriate. So when you see something you can do that you can use to serve God, yasehu, do that. V'im lav, and if you think that doing that, whatever that is not going to bring you closer to God, lo yasehu, don't do that. What is this? This is asking myself not only what did God tell me in the Torah, what did God authorize the rabbis to tell me, let's say with kashrut and other halachot, but what would God want me to do? Umishanohei Cain, somebody who acts this way, Ovedet Boro Tamid, is serving his creator all the time. Meaning, you can keep halacha and serve God periodically. Every time you make a kashrut decision, that's the way of serving God. Every time you say an official prayer, you're serving God. But how about the rest of the day? Could be you're on your own. Technically, you are. But he's saying you have the option of elevating even ordinary things to the service of God if you think about how it can help you serve God. Or if you make choices based on whether it will help you serve God. That's Rav Karo. A variation of this, which is more like, let's be stereotypical, Rambam, who was not only a rabbi, but also a doctor. The Rambam writes in Hilchot Deot, he quotes the same idea, but he puts it in terms of health. When you eat, you should not just eat because you're eating kosher food. You should eat so that your body will be healthy. When you eat and drink, don't have in mind that you're just enjoying it only. It's not that you can't enjoy it, but not only to enjoy it. Because if that's the only thing you have in mind when you eat, then it'll turn out you'll end up eating only the stuff that's sweet. Right. Well, grown-ups are supposed to stop doing that, right? We eat sweet stuff for dessert, but not for the whole meal, right? Where grown-ups are not supposed to be in the situation where they eat so much candy that they have a stomach ache. Now, that's what you expect from a kid who doesn't have any self-control. But adults are supposed to have self-control, going back to what we said before. Ella, rather, the Rambam says, Yasima libo, what should you have in mind when you eat? That you eat and drink in order to make your body healthy. And consequently, you don't eat just anything your body desires, anything your palate desires, kikelev v'chamor, like a dog or a donkey. Notice that this goes back to the what separates people from animals. Rather, you should eat the things that you know are good for your body, whether they're sweet or not. And you should make sure not to eat the things that you, to the best of your medical knowledge, you know are not good for you. So that's a second approach that appears in the Rambam. That is in Hilchot Deot Perik Gimel Halacha Bet, and the next halacha, just going to see this very briefly. He specifies a little bit more. Yasima libo, you should have in mind. Sheyehe gufo shalem v'chazak. Why am I eating this? So that my body will be complete. My body will be strong. Kadeshia nafsho yishar aladat Hashem. Why do I want my body to be strong? So that my soul, so that my intellect, depending on how you read this, will be able to serve God as well. So the idea of a sound mind in a sound body, the Rambam thinks this goes together, and not just from a doctor perspective, but that meaning you need to act like a human being and be selective of what to eat because you want your body to be strong. But why do you want your body to be strong? So that you can serve God properly. They're both correct. So the Rambam brings up the health aspect, which Rav Karo, following Rabbeinu Yonah, they do not bring that up, but it ends up being a variation on the same idea. And the Rambam goes on to say, and then when you're walking, when you're sleeping, and then he quotes the same Mishnah Perkei Avot that Rav Karo we saw quoted. V'chol masecha yu l'shem Shamayim. All your actions should be for the sake of heaven, and as it says in Mishlei, we didn't see it inside, but Rav Karo quotes this as well. B'chol drachecha de'ehu. You should know God in all your ways. So knowing God in all your ways is presumably, maybe not at all times, because that might be really hard, but when you're making a choice. When you're making a choice about what to do next or how to do what you're doing next. If you can think about how this is going to serve God or not, that would be the ideal. And just to wrap up this section with a quote, which is from two quotes from Hasidic masters, Reb Elimelech of Lezhensk, he's the better known one, and Noam Elimelech, and Rav Zechariah Mandel. Both of these quotes I got from this book, Jewish Spiritual Practices, by Yitzchak Buxbaum. It's a pretty big book. It's over 700 pages. He pulls together in all sorts of different categories ideas from Musar literature and Hasidic literature about how to make everything in your life a spiritual thing. So I haven't gone through a lot of it, but the stuff that I've gone through has some useful stuff. So the quote from Rav Elimelech is, you have to sanctify yourself in eating, drinking, and money. Yoter mina Torah o tefillah. More than you have to sanctify yourself when you learn Torah or when you pray to God. He goes on to say, why? Because when you're doing things that are obviously spiritual, learning Torah or praying, the Yetzer Hara has less power over you because you're already doing a godly thing, a spiritual thing. But when you are doing physical things, doing things that relate to this world, then the Yetzer Hara, the side of you that wants to that pushes you to make the wrong decisions, it's got more power. It's easier to convince people, I don't have to make the right choice, because there isn't a right choice here. It's only eating, or it's only business. Business is business, or all is fair in love and war, and other things where halacha doesn't obviously apply. It's easy to forget that these can be ways of sanctifying oneself. And Rav Elimelech goes on to say, when it comes to a tzaddik, remember in Hasidic literature, the tzaddik is the ultimate person, not just a righteous person, but the ideal. For a tzaddik, ein chiluk bein Torah o tefillah o achilo shtia. There's no difference between learning Torah, praying to God, or eating and drinking. Hakolhu, everything for a tzaddik is avodat haborei. It's all the service of God. Ve'enu ela chiluf me avodah avodah. So when the tzaddik is finished davening and goes to eat, The tzaddik isn't leaving spirituality and going to the material, the physical world. No, the tzaddik is simply going from one way of serving God to another way of serving God. This is what we might associate with the Hasidic, the classic Hasidic idea of sanctifying the world. There's a chapter on this in Rabbi Norman Lamb's book, Torah Umada, in which he wants to extend this Hasidic idea to the study of general studies, even though the Hasidim themselves don't actually do that. He admits that. But just one more Hasidic quote. This is from the Darkei Tzedek, not as well known a book. Rav Zachariah Mendel writes, Ikar ha'avodah hi achila. Wow. Not only is it also a way to serve God, you can also serve God through eating. He says, no. The main way of serving God is not through the spiritual, but through the physical. Wow. And then he says something which is similar to Rav Elimelech. The way he formally would say it is Hatzadikim choshvim ve'ochlim. The tzadikim, when they're thinking or when they're eating, be'ahavav yirat Hashem, they're always feeling love of God and awe of God, kamo batfila, just like when they're praying. So fascinating idea. I just saw this quote the other day, not about eating, but about doing the right thing. 1 second, I get the name of the book. Yes, there is a picture book written by Richard Mickelson and illustrated by Raoul Colon. It's called As Good as Anybody, Martin Luther King and Abraham Joshua Heschel's Amazing March Toward Freedom. I just read it or reread it. As picture books go, I think it's pretty good. The text, the pictures, and it has the line in there, the famous line from Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, reflecting on marching with Dr. King for civil rights. I felt like my legs were praying, which sounds kind of funny, but he was coming from a Hasidic tradition. He was, if he hadn't become a professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary, he could have been the Apta Rav, like his namesake, Rav Avram Yeshua Heschel of Apta. Okay, so it sounds funny when you hear it in English, but Rabbi Heschel was just saying a variation on this classic Hasidic idea. Okay, so now we're done with the hashkafic part of this session, and now I want to move into a topic that relates to halacha or minhag, and not necessarily directly connected to the hashkafa topic. Okay, why do we cover the challahs during Kiddush on Shabbat? Now, you probably have heard of a reason. You might have even heard of 2 reasons, but it turns out that there are 3 reasons. This is not myth busting. I'm not going to argue that what you heard is all wrong. But there is a 3rd reason, and all 3 reasons appear in the Rishonim. We're not going to go through the source in great detail, but just briefly, Tosfot, the first one chronologically to mention this, quotes an even earlier source, the She'il Tod, written by one of the Gaonim, meaning rabbis, the heads of the Babylonian yeshivot before the time of the Rishonim, more or less before 1,000 or so. Covering the challah, covering the bread that you're about to make a motzi on, is in order to make this meal yikara de Shabbata. The yikara is kavod, to make this meal in honor of Shabbat. Question is, why does covering the challah make it a situation of honoring Shabbat? It doesn't have to be complicated. You could just say, normally, even if you eat bread at every meal, and people used to do that, they wouldn't cover the bread. Covering the bread is saying this meal is special. We only do this for Shabbat and Yom Tov. That's good enough. That's a reason to cover it. It's not because of Kiddush per se. It's because of Shabbat. Shabbat is special. That's the first reason. For some reason, nobody's ever heard of that one. But it's the first one given chronologically. And then Tosfot goes on to give a second reason. Some say zecher laman, covering the bread before we make a motzi is in order to remember the man, the manna that God gave us in the desert, which, according to the Gemara, did not fall on Shabbat and Yom Tov. So Shabbat was a way to remember, wow, Shabbat is special. They didn't have calendars back then, but the man, which was a miraculous thing every day, it did not fall on Shabbat or Yom Tov. And when it did fall, there was dew. There was a layer of tal, dew, above the man and below the man. The man was in the middle. So when you make a motzi on lechem mishnah, it's not spelled out here, but lechem mishnah having 2 loaves they don't have to be challah, but ideally they should be 2 loaves. Why do we have 2 loaves at all? That's also because of the man. A double portion of man fell on Friday. So an extra way to remember the man is to have a covering above it, the bread, the covering above and the covering below it. So the covering below it is the covering of your tablecloth, assuming that there's a value in having a tablecloth, and people talk about that as well as making Shabbat special. But the covering above it, it's not because of Shabbat directly, and it certainly is not because of Kiddush. It's to remember the man. Okay, that's the second answer. The Mordechai, one of the followers of Tosfot, living a little bit later in the 1200s, he mentions the honoring Shabbat, and then he says, but I don't understand. To honor Shabbat, it should be enough if you cover the bread at night. Why should you also have to cover it by day? Like at night, you're ushering in Shabbat. In the morning, it's already here. So why should you cover it during the day as well? So he says there must be another reason. Not necessarily the first one is wrong, but not enough. And the extra reason that he gives is not the man, but a different reason. Shelo levayesh et hapat, so as not to quote unquote embarrass the bread. What do you mean? He explains. B'chol yom, every day, ordinarily, mevarchin al hapat kodem l'yayin. If you're starting your meal with bread and wine, following ordinary rules of brachot, which one do you make the bracha on first? The bread, because bread is the most important food or drink in halacha. So, and this is in fact a practical halacha. If for whatever reason you have wine, it's not Shabbat or Yom Tov, you have wine and bread. You don't say you don't say borei piragafen first. You make a motzi first. And then whether you make a separate borei piragafen or not depends on other issues. But now on Shabbat, anu makdimin levarach al hayayin. We are saying the bracha on the wine first. Why are we doing that? Because the special mitzvah of Kiddush. So since we are not giving the bread the usual great honor of going first, therefore we cover it so it doesn't have to, so we're not disrespecting the bread. That's formulated as so we don't embarrass the bread. Nobody actually thinks that bread has feelings. But the way the Mordechai formulates it here, it's not about feelings, it's about a reminder that the rules of brachot, the order of brachot on Shabbat, are different from the order of brachot during the rest of the week. And in fact, he goes on to say, I heard from Rabbi Avraham, one of his teachers, that she'im hayapat megula. Let's say you come to sit down for your Shabbat meal, and let's say the bread is uncovered. Well, then, then you would have to make a motzi before Kiddush. Meaning, according to this, it's not that we don't want to disrespect the bread. It's that we want to follow the rule of making Kiddush before motzi. In order to follow that rule, the bread has to be covered, or else we would be obligated to follow the regular rule. If the bread is covered, then we can say, oh, I don't see any bread. I guess I'll make the bracha on the wine. What Rabbi Avram just did here is he came to the same conclusion, but without anthropomorphism, without talking about the feelings of the bread. So if you ever meet anybody who says, "Well, this stupid thing about why are we pretending that bread has feelings?" You could argue that at least the second way that the Mordechai presents this idea, it's not actually about anthropomorphizing the bread. Okay, just a little bit more on this. What are the practical differences between these reasons? Every time you have a halacha and then multiple reasons for the halacha, there might very well be practical differences between whether this is the reason or that is the reason. And a couple of these appear in the Mishnah Berurah, and a couple of them appear in the contemporary book Piskei Teshuvot. I'll just summarize them now. Let's say you're making Kiddush on the bread, which seems a little weird, but there is a thing. For whatever reason, you don't have any access to wine or grape juice. You have bread. Well, then you're supposed to do Netilat Yadayim, say Kiddush, and then make a motzi, and that way you fulfill. It's b'diavad. It's not ideal, but okay, you fulfill the mitzvah of Kiddush even without wine. That's right. So according to this, the Mishnah Berurah says, let's say you're doing Kiddush on bread. There's no reason to cover the bread if the reason to cover the bread is in the presence of wine. There is no wine. We're talking about a case where there is no wine. Then there's no reason to cover the bread. That's if you follow that reason. But if you say, oh, well, Zecher Laman, covering the bread has nothing to do with Kiddush, it's because we want to have a covering on top and a covering below the bread, well, then it has nothing to do with whether there's Kiddush. Then you should always cover the bread. That's a practical difference, whether we think this reason is the better one or the other one's the better one. And then he goes on to say that how about when should you uncover the bread? If the point of covering the bread is because of Kiddush, because you should have the bread covered in the presence of the wine, well then, right after you make Kiddush, you should be able to uncover the bread, because with the reason about the order brachot is not relevant anymore. You already said the first bracha. But if you say that it's in memory of to commemorate the man, well then in that case, again, it's nothing to do with Kiddush. Then maybe you should keep the bread covered until not just until you're about to make the motzi, until actually after the motzi. Some people do this. I've seen this. They make it look like a magic trick. They pick up the bread underneath the cover. Like, ooh, I wonder what this person's holding. They're following this opinion. It's also very dramatic. I don't follow this opinion. Well, my wife makes the motzi in my house anyway, most of the time. But whichever one of us makes the motzi, we take the challah cover off beforehand because we don't think that the symbolism of the man has to extend up through the bracha. So that does not have to depend on this. How about a transparent challah cover? Aha, does that count or not? Okay, just to mention that as a possibility. It's brought up in source number 4. That might be a practical difference between the different reasons, but this one is actually a practical one. Okay. My wife follows the strict opinion that no food is on the table until after the motzi. We don't put out any food at all. And if for whatever reason we had to put out food, we would cover it. Why? Because there is an opinion, Rav Moshe Feinstein, not just a random person, but like a very important posek. He says that all of the bread and the other food, if it's on the table, it should all be covered during Kiddush, not just what you're going to make a motzi on. Meaning you could say, first of all, you could say, well, only the bread needs to be covered, not other food. Or you could say, only the bread that I'm going to make a motzi on has to be covered. Let's say for whatever reason I have like a bread basket. I have a lechem mishnah. There's also other bread on the table. Do I have to cover the other bread also? So you could say, no. If you follow the opinion that it's about either making Shabbat special or remembering the man, it has nothing to do with the rest of the bread. This bread, these 2 loaves that I'm making a motzi on, these should be covered. But the other stuff doesn't have to be covered. Okay, but if you follow the opinion that it's about what bracha you say, what food is exposed in the presence of the Kiddush, in the presence of the wine, should you make a Kiddush when other food is on the table? If you're following that opinion, then there's room to say that either all the other bread should be covered, or possibly all the other food should be covered. Lots of people are not strict like this, but the reason to be strict is if you're following the opinion that it's about the order of the brachot. Let's just wrap up this section by talking about people who miss the point. Okay, Rav Mordechai Kamenetsky tells a story about Rav Shraga Feivel Mendelovitz. I heard this story told about Rav Yisrael Salanter, but I couldn't find it documented anywhere. Apparently, it's a story told about a great ethical person. It seems more likely that it's about Rav Shraga Feivel, because if it were really Rav Yisrael Salanter, I would have expected it to be all over the place that he's... Anyway, so Rav Shraga Feivel was the founder of Yeshiva Torah Vadat. Once he stayed in Miami for Shabbos, the home of a former student. When the man opened the door after coming home from shul, he was shocked and embarrassed. His wife, exhausted from a week's worth of child rearing and the responsibility of keeping a home, was sprawled on the couch. The Shabbos table was half set. The dishes placed in a pile next to the Kiddush cup and wine. In front of the head seat were two large challahs sitting uncovered. Dot, dot, dot. The student called out to his wife in a demeaning manner, "Let's prepare the table in its entirety." Like I can't believe, I brought home the great rabbi, and this is what my house looks like. Turning his mentor, he exclaimed, "I'm sure that leaving the bread uncovered was an oversight. Everyone knows," he exclaimed, shifting his self-inflicted embarrassment on his wife, "that we must cover the challah before the Kiddush." Rav Mendelovitz was annoyed at the man's self-righteous behavior. This is the way that Rav Kamenetsky is telling the story. Rav Mendelovitz said, "Over the years, I've heard many problems that people faced. Students, couples, adults from all walks of life have entered my office to discuss their personal situations with me. Not once did a challah ever enter my office, suffering an inferiority complex because it was left uncovered during Kiddush. You know why? Because we are not concerned with the challah. We are concerned about making ourselves cognizant of feelings. We worry about challahs, or we go through the motions of worrying about challahs, because the goal is to worry about people. How then can you embarrass your wife over not covering the challah when the act of covering is supposed to train you in sensitivity?" Ouch. Okay, good story. It's a good story that reminds us that sometimes even the opinions that look silly actually have something deep and profound about them. So when you're teaching people who are not aware of this about covering the challah, if they're not aware, tell them we cover the challah so as not to embarrass the Kiddush cup, the Kiddush, whatever, the wine, and then tell them this story. So to put it in proper perspective. Okay, I want to wrap up this topic and briefly share with you some recipes and snack ideas that relate to Parsha Ba'alotcha, which those of you who are outside of the land of Israel are reading in Shabbat this week, and also Parshat Shlach, which we in Israel are reading this week. So these are just, in each case, I have 2 pages. If you want to print them out, I hope if you have a color printer, good idea. But if you have a black and white printer, it's not necessarily going to look so impressive. Anyway, so just a couple of them with tie in with, and then just very briefly, and then I'll look at the chat. In Parsha Ba'alotcha, the slav, the quail. So somebody came up with making a bunch of little babkas that look like birds. Okay. Someone else, these are both from the Facebook group called Parsha Desserts. Someone else came up with the idea of having brownies that are very long, and you put on each one something that looks like a match to represent the lighting of the menorah. Gonna skip the next part just in the interest of time. Double Portion is a blog from a little over 10 years ago. By somebody who wrote, Alicia Gechter, she wrote a whole bunch of recipes, elaborate recipes, each one tying into something in the parsha. So she mentions that in Ba'alotcha there's meat, quail, fish, watermelon, cucumbers, onions, leeks, and garlic. That's a lot of different types of food mentioned in the parsha. So her recipes are fish with garlic cilantro sauce and watermelon and cucumber salad. So that's our recipes for Ba'alotcha. For those of you who are in Eretz Yisrael, we have recipes for Parshat Shlach. Don't worry, those of you who are outside of Israel, I'll upload this page also next week for Shlach. one of the famous, besides the spies, one of the topics in Parshat Shlach is tzitzit at the end of the Parsha. So here's tzitzis Oreos, which is chocolate-covered Oreos, which are then covered with tzitzit made with in white chocolate mold. Anyway, and then of course you need to put it in this very fancy plastic holder. Very impressive. And if you don't have a mold, then you buy white and blue pull and peel licorice. Uh, right, and that's more or less in the next version, which probably took a little less time. We have crackers, or I guess square cookies that have the white frosting, and then the blue licorice to represent the tzitziot. Very cute. That's actually from that was actually just posted yesterday on the Parsha Desserts blog by this woman Melanie, who has her own Instagram account called Parsha Desserts. And finally, Rena Rosner, who's written a bunch of novels. I've read one of them, fantasy with the Jewish themes. She also wrote a bunch of recipes and published a cookbook of recipes that relate to the Parsha, glossy photos, etc. But before she did that, she first wrote it over the course of a couple of years in the Jerusalem Post. And this is the original recipe from that appeared in the Jerusalem Post in 2007. That the spies brought back grapes and pomegranates and figs. So the obvious thing to do is serve Meraglim fruit salad. And here's the picture copied from her book, which it looks like ordinary fruit salad, but it's in memory of the spies. Okay, so that's just a few interesting ideas about that you could use either for food in general or desserts for the parsha. So I want to thank everybody for joining me. Let's look at the chat. Okay, Rebecca asked, were tables covered with a tablecloth on weekdays at the time of Tosfot? I don't know. I'm guessing not, but I'm not sure. I guess you'd have to speak with a historian of early medieval Franco Germany, or whatever, 1100s, 1200s. I'm not sure. Mark said the miracle of the man occurred on Friday morning. Why don't we commemorate it then? Right, because because the miracle was, well, there's a lot to say, but just one possibility is that there's a miracle of when something happens at the right time, and there's a miracle when something doesn't happen at the right time. So Shabbat, the Jews could tell when it was Shabbat by the man not falling. And the way that they commemorate this, Hashem told them before Shabbat, is you will have a double portion on Friday. Double portion on Friday is for the sake of Shabbat. So on Shabbat, the rabbi said, we need to have 3 meals because it's mentioned 3 times in the pasuk about the man. It's mentioned about having a double portion. So having the 3 meals, having 2 loaves, that's all for the man. That's all straight out of the Gemara. So in the Middle Ages, rabbis coming up with the idea of covering the man on, covering the challah, covering the loaves on the top and the bottom, is just fitting into this scheme that we're already commemorating the man on Shabbat. I see that Mark wrote, covering the bread is sort of like the fiction of covering your eyes during candle lighting. That would be an interesting topic to do. Like, when do we cover which parts and why? Technically covering the eyes during candle lighting is for a different reason. The question is that actually necessary or not? And who said you have to go like this, 3 times? Because that's the way that your mother did it, and that's the way that her mother did it. My impression is that that's not actually required, but that would be an interesting thing to look at. And then while we're at it, covering the eyes during the Shema. And not looking at the Kohanim during a Birkat Kohanim. Okay, that's not exactly covering it. We discussed that in myth busting. I see that Noah asked, why not just be machmir and cover the bread in all cases? Was that talking about? I don't remember what we were saying at that
It
time.
was in relation to when do we cover the bread? Like, do we need to cover it like immediately? Do we need to cover, like when to cover it and when to uncover it? Because there's no harm in just covering it.
Right, right. So I think that's probably why. I mean, look, there's no absolute, there's no like bottom line on this. That's probably why I'm guessing that a lot of people that people do usually not uncover the bread right away, but they just wait until they're about to make the motzi. The question is, do they take the cover off right before making the motzi or right after? But that, I would argue that that's a relatively minor difference. But since you mentioned, I just want to add something that I skipped before, but it's near the end of source number 4 on the page about covering the challah. The Aruch HaShulchan thinks the main reason is the don't embarrass the bread thing. And that's why he suggests that even though some rabbi wrote your challah cover should be white, because the man was described as being white, or the layer was described as being white. The Aruch HaShulchan says, no, it's not. You don't have to go that far. That's not even the main reason anyway. And the Piskei Teshuvot quotes the Aruch HaShulchan and says maybe that's why many people do not cover all the rest of the food. Or even just the other breads. Let's say you're at a meal with a lot of people and everybody has their own bread. But one person made Kiddush. And a lot of those yeshivot camps, whatever, they don't tell everybody, you have to cover, everybody has to cover their own bread during Kiddush. Why not? Well, there is an opinion that you should, but it's not necessary, meaning it's following the stricter opinion. And that's okay, but that it does not become an actual obligation. See that Mark wrote he's seen people cover the mizonot during the Kiddush, right? Noah points out that covering the eyes for a candle lighting is for a different reason, so as not to benefit from the light before making the bracha, and just to keep it going, and covering the eyes during the Shema is so that we don't get distracted. Nevertheless, it's interesting to compare and contrast, and there are people who give other reasons for each of these. Anyway, some good points here. Does anybody have any last comments that they want to make, either in the chat or by unmuting themselves and talking?
I just wanted to say thank you, but also I really like the way this particular class is. You've got like theoretical, philosophical thing, and then the practical stuff. It's a really fun little combo. I like it very much.
Thank you, and don't forget the fun parsha stuff at the end. When I taught this earlier, a variation of this earlier this year at Midrashet Moriah, I also brought in parsha snacks just to make it more interesting. But that we can't do for technical reasons. But that is if you're actually teaching this in person, so that would be the next level. Bring in something that everybody can eat. Or prepare or decorate or whatever. And a bunch of the blogs that deal with Parsha food, that's what they're doing. Let's have Parsha fun. Let's have Parsha activities with our kids, whether it's a something in the kitchen or an arts and crafts project. There's a whole bunch of those blogs and websites and Facebook groups. Anyway, thanks again to everybody for joining me, and hope to see you next week. Next week we will have one, as of now anyway, next week will be the only week in which we'll have only one hashkafa topic instead of two, but that's because it'll be a big hashkafa topic, namely the topic of vegetarianism. That'll be a hashkafa topic, and it'll also be a halacha topic, so we'll end up talking pretty much the whole time about vegetarianism. It's something I have a lot invested in personally, so that's my personal bias. Anyway, once again, thanks to everybody for joining me. Have a Shabbat Shalom and have a great week.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Yeah.
Okay, take care.